At the local shooting range in a small town in Virginia, there was an elderly black man who had become something of a regular. Every Saturday morning, without fail, he'd roll up in his old pickup truck, rusty and dented from years of use. He wasn't flashy or loud. If anything, he blended into the background. His faded jeans and worn-out flannel shirt made him look like just another guy trying to pass the time. Nobody really paid much attention to him, and that seemed to suit him fine. This quiet man moved with slow, deliberate motions, almost as though every action carried meaning. He'd open the tailgate of his truck, pull out his custom-built .45 caliber pistol, and head straight for his usual spot at the range. There, he'd set up his gear with practiced ease, loading magazines with steady hands before taking aim. And when he fired, well, let's just say no one could ignore how precise his shots were. Each bullet hit its mark with surgical accuracy, leaving even seasoned shooters exchanging glances of admiration, or maybe envy. But here's the thing about this man. He didn't talk much. In fact, most people couldn't recall ever hearing him speak beyond a polite nod or a brief, "good" morning as he passed by. He kept to himself, focusing entirely on his craft, lost in thought while others chatted and laughed around him. To everyone else at the range, he was just another hobbyist, a retired military vet perhaps, or maybe a former cop who preferred solitude over conversation. No one knew his story, and frankly, no one bothered to ask. After all, why would they? He was just a quiet old man doing what he loved. That is, until one particular Saturday changed everything. On this day, a young recruit showed up at the range. This kid was different from the usual crowd. He buzzed with energy, his eyes darting everywhere, soaking in every detail. You could tell he was eager, hungry to prove himself. Maybe he was preparing for some kind of special forces training, judging by the way he carried himself. Whatever it was, he clearly took his time at the range seriously. As the kid settled into his lane, he couldn't help but notice the older man a few stations down. At first, it was the sound, the sharp crack of the pistol followed by near-perfect silence between shots that caught his attention. Then, it was the precision. The target paper 20 yards away looked more like Swiss cheese than a bullseye after only a few minutes. But what really stopped the kid cold was something else entirely. When the older man leaned forward to adjust his stance, the sleeve of his shirt slid back slightly, revealing a glimpse of ink beneath his skin. It wasn't just any tattoo. It was faded, yes, but unmistakable. 2 crossed rifles framed by bold letters spelled out Delta Force. The kid froze mid-reload. Delta Force? That wasn't just any unit. It was the stuff of legends, one of the most secretive and elite groups in the entire U.S. military. These were the guys who operated in the shadows, pulling off missions so classified they'd never make headlines. They were warriors among warriors, handpicked from the best of the best. And now, apparently, one of them was sitting right here, quietly cleaning his gun like it was no big deal. Curiosity burned inside the kid. How could someone like this exist in plain sight without anyone knowing? Was he really part of Delta Force? What stories did he have tucked away behind those calm eyes? Questions raced through the kid's mind, each one louder than the last. Finally, unable to resist, he approached the older man cautiously, unsure of how to start. Excuse me, sir," the kid began, fumbling over his words. I saw your tattoo. Are you really?" The older man glanced up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the kid thought he might have overstepped. But then, slowly, the corner of the man's mouth twitched upward into the faintest hint of a smile. "You don't need to know everything about me, son," the man said, his voice low and steady. There was warmth there, but also a firmness that suggested he meant what he said. Still, the kid pressed on, asking about tactics, discipline, and what it took to join such an elite group. To his surprise, the older man didn't shut him down completely. Instead, he started sharing bits of wisdom, not war stories, but practical advice about focus, patience, and the importance of observation. Over the course of their conversation, the kid learned that the man's name was Elijah Washington, and though he refused to divulge specifics, it became clear that he had indeed been part of Delta Force during the Vietnam War era. For the first time, The kid realized that this quiet old man wasn't just another face at the range. He was someone extraordinary, hidden in plain sight, carrying a lifetime of experiences that most people could only dream of understanding. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the range, the kid knew one thing. For certain, Elijah's presence there was anything but ordinary. The young recruit couldn't stop thinking about the older man. That tattoo, those quiet words of wisdom. It all felt like a door slightly ajar, teasing him with the promise of something deeper. He found himself returning to the shooting range every weekend, not just to practice, but to see if he could learn more about this mysterious figure. Each time, he'd try to strike up a conversation, asking questions about tactics, discipline, and the mindset it took to be part of such an elite unit. At first, the older man was reluctant. He wasn't one for small talk or grand stories, but the kid's persistence and his genuine curiosity started to wear him down. Slowly, bit by bit, the older man began opening up. What came out weren't dramatic tales of heroism or daring rescues. Instead, they were lessons wrapped in anecdotes delivered in a tone that felt almost casual, as though he were sharing secrets meant only for those willing to listen closely. One Saturday, after the kid had spent hours peppering him with questions, the older man finally sighed and leaned back against the bench. "You really want to know what it takes?" he asked, his voice tinged with both amusement and resignation. The kid nodded eagerly, his eyes wide with anticipation. "It's not about being the strongest or the fastest," the older man continued. "Anyone can pull a trigger. Anyone can run fast or lift heavy weights. But real strength, real skill, that comes from here." He tapped his temple lightly, then placed a hand over his heart. "It's about how you think, how you see the world around you, and it's about staying calm when everything else is falling apart." The kid listened intently, hanging on every word. The older man went on to explain the importance of patience, not just on the battlefield, but in life itself. "Rushing gets people killed," he said simply. "You wait, you watch, you plan. Only then do you act. And when you do, you make sure it counts." He also talked about humility, something the kid hadn't expected. "A true warrior doesn't seek glory," the older man said firmly. "Glory fades, but purpose lasts. If you're doing it for the right reasons, for your team, for your country, for something bigger than yourself, you'll never lose sight of why you started." These lessons weren't delivered in long speeches or dramatic monologues. They came in short bursts, often while the older man was reloading his pistol or adjusting his stance. Sometimes he'd pause mid-sentence to take a shot, the bullet hitting dead center before he resumed speaking as if nothing had happened. It was this effortless blend of action and insight that left the kid awestruck. Here was someone who didn't just talk the talk, he lived it, breathed it, embodied it. Word spread quickly among the other regulars at the range. Whispers began circulating about the quiet old man who might have been part of Delta Force. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, while others were convinced it had to be true. After all, no ordinary person could shoot like that, let alone carry themselves with such quiet authority. A few even tried approaching him directly, hoping to get a glimpse into his past, but the older man remained elusive, deflecting their questions with polite smiles and vague responses. The kid, however, noticed something interesting. While the older man was guarded with everyone else, he seemed to soften slightly during their conversations. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the kid could tell. There was a flicker of pride in his eyes when he explained the finer points of marksmanship, a hint of nostalgia in his voice when he mentioned certain principles that had guided him throughout his career. It was clear that he enjoyed passing on his knowledge, even if he did so sparingly. Over time, the kid realized that the older man wasn't just teaching him about firearms or combat strategies. He was imparting life lessons, lessons about resilience, integrity, and the weight of responsibility. The kid began applying these teachings not just at the range, but in his daily life. Whether it was staying focused during grueling workouts or maintaining composure under pressure, he found himself drawing on the older man's advice more and more. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, the kid mustered the courage to ask a question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. "Sir, he began hesitantly. "Why don't you ever talk about your missions? I mean, you've obviously done incredible things. Why keep it all to yourself?" The older man paused, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might brush off the question altogether. But then, with a deep sigh, he set down his gun and turned to face the kid. "Some things are better left unsaid," he replied softly. "Not because they're secret, but because, well, some memories aren't meant to be shared. They're too heavy, too painful." His voice trailed off, and for the first time the kid saw cracks in the older man's armor. There was a sadness in his eyes, a shadow of something unspoken. It was fleeting, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but it lingered in the air between them. The kid didn't push further. He understood instinctively that some wounds ran deeper than words could heal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the range, the kid felt a newfound respect for the older man. He realized that the quiet confidence, the precision, the wisdom, all of it came from a lifetime of experiences, many of which the older man would likely never share. And yet, despite his reticence, he had chosen to pass on fragments of his knowledge, trusting the kid enough to carry them forward. That day marked a turning point in their relationship. The kid stopped seeing the older man as merely a source of information or inspiration. Instead, he began to view him as a mentor, a guide who had walked paths few could imagine and emerged with lessons worth treasuring. Though the older man still kept much of his past hidden, the kid knew one thing for certain. Whatever secrets he carried, they shaped him into the extraordinary person he was today. As weeks turned into months, the bond between the young recruit and the older man grew stronger. Their conversations became less about questions and answers and more like exchanges between two people who genuinely respected each other. The kid wasn't just learning technical skills anymore. He was starting to see the world through the lens of someone who had lived a life full of challenges, sacrifices, and hard-won wisdom. One Saturday morning, as the sun broke through the mist hanging over the range, the older man arrived later than usual. He moved slower that day, his steps deliberate but heavier. The kid noticed right away and approached him with concern. "You okay, sir?" he asked, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the worry in his voice. The older man gave a small chuckle, brushing off the question with a wave of his hand. "Just an old war injury acting up," he said lightly, as if it were no big deal. But the kid wasn't convinced. He could see the slight grimace when the older man bent down to pick up his gear, the way he paused for a moment before straightening back up. "Let me help you with that," the kid offered, already reaching for the box of ammunition the older man had set on the ground. For a second it looked like the older man might protest, but then he nodded silently, allowing the assistance. That simple act opened a door neither of them had expected. As they worked side by side setting up the lane, the older man began talking, not about tactics or marksmanship this time, but about himself. It started with a brief mention of growing up poor in Mississippi, where opportunities were scarce, and racism made them even harder to come by. His tone was matter-of-fact, as though recounting someone else's story rather than his own. "I wanted to join the army since I was a kid," he said, loading a magazine with steady hands. "But back then they didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for guys like me. Took everything I had just to get my foot in the door." The kid listened intently, imagining what it must have been like to fight not only for your country but also against prejudice at home. The older man went on to describe how he clawed his way through basic training, determined to prove himself despite the odds stacked against him. By the time he earned his spot in one of the toughest selection processes in the world, Delta Force, he had already faced battles most people couldn't comprehend. It wasn't easy, the older man admitted, his voice tinged with both pride and pain. But nothing worth doing ever is. For the first time, the kid got a glimpse of the sheer willpower it took for the older man to rise above his circumstances. It wasn't just talent or skill that had gotten him there. It was resilience, grit, and an unshakable belief in himself. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were living truths embodied by the man standing beside him. But there were moments during their conversations when the older man's demeanor shifted. Sometimes, when discussing certain missions or memories, his face would harden and his tone would grow distant. It was clear that not all of his experiences had been victories, and some scars ran deeper than any bullet wound. One rainy afternoon, after a particularly intense session at the range, the older man sat quietly on the bench, staring off into the distance. The kid hesitated for a moment before sitting down next to him. Neither of them spoke for a while, the patter of raindrops filling the silence. Finally, the older man broke it with a sigh. "You ever wonder why I don't talk much about my missions?" he asked, his gaze still fixed ahead. The kid shook his head, unsure of how to respond. "It's not because I'm proud or ashamed," the older man continued. "It's because, well, some things stay with you. No matter how much time passes, they never leave. And sometimes talking about them makes them feel closer, you know?" The kid nodded slowly, beginning to understand. The older man wasn't just guarding secrets. He was protecting himself, and maybe others, from the weight of those memories. He went on to share fragments of a mission gone wrong, a covert operation deep behind enemy lines where half his team perished. Though he survived, the guilt of leadership stayed with him long after the war ended. "I've seen things no man should ever see," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I've done things I can't undo." Tears welled in the kid's eyes as he listened. This wasn't the invincible warrior he had imagined. This was a human being, flawed and fragile, carrying burdens far heavier than medals or accolades. In that moment, the kid realized why the older man preferred solitude. It wasn't bitterness or pride, but a need to protect others from the ghosts that lingered within him. Despite these glimpses into his haunted past, the older man remained guarded about the specifics of his service. Yet, even through his reticence, the kid felt honored to learn from someone who embodied the values he hoped to achieve himself. Each lesson, each shared memory brought him closer to understanding what it truly meant to be strong, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. By the end of that rainy afternoon, the kid knew one thing for certain. The older man wasn't just teaching him how to shoot or strategize. He was showing him how to carry the weight of responsibility, how to endure hardship, and how to find purpose in the face of adversity. These weren't just lessons for the battlefield. They were lessons for life. The rain had stopped by the time the older man finished speaking, leaving behind a damp stillness that clung to the air. The kid sat there on the bench beside him, feeling like he'd been let in on something sacred, something fragile and raw. He didn't know what to say, so he stayed quiet, letting the weight of the older man's words settle between them. It was one thing to hear about sacrifice or loss in abstract terms. It was another entirely to sit next to someone who carried those burdens in their bones. After a while, the older man stood up slowly, wincing slightly as he straightened his back. "Come on," he said, his voice steady again, though softer than usual. "Let's get back to work." The kid nodded and followed him back to their lane at the range. They resumed practicing, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was no more casual banter or curious questions. Instead, they moved in sync, focused and deliberate, each shot ringing out like punctuation marks in an unspoken conversation. The kid found himself paying closer attention to every little detail. The way the older man adjusted his grip, how he controlled his breathing, the calm precision with which he pulled the trigger. It wasn't just technique anymore. It felt like watching poetry in motion. Later that day, as they packed up their gear, the older man paused and looked at the kid for a long moment. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," he said finally, breaking the silence. The kid blinked, surprised by the unexpected compliment. Or maybe it wasn't a compliment at all, but an observation. "You've got fire," the older man continued, his tone thoughtful. "That's good. But remember this. Fire burns brightest when it's controlled. Don't let your eagerness blind you to the bigger picture." The kid nodded, absorbing the advice. He wanted to ask what the bigger picture meant exactly, but something told him not to push. Some things he was learning needed to be figured out on their own. Over the next few weeks, the kid noticed subtle changes in the older man. He seemed more open, willing to share bits of his past that he'd kept hidden before. Sometimes it was a story about boot camp and the grueling physical tests he endured. Other times it was a lesson about teamwork, how trusting your comrades could mean the difference between life and death. Each tale painted a clearer picture of the man sitting across from him. Disciplined, courageous, yet deeply human. But there were moments when the older man's guard slipped entirely, revealing glimpses of the pain he carried. One particularly cold Saturday morning, the kid arrived early and found the older man already there, staring at the target paper blankly. His hands rested on his knees, and his shoulders sagged in a way that made him look smaller somehow. Cold. Weather gets to me, the older man admitted when the kid asked if everything was okay. Brings back memories. He didn't elaborate, but the kid didn't need him to. By now he understood that some wounds never fully healed. They just faded into scars that ached under certain conditions. That day, the older man shared more than he ever had before. He talked about the camaraderie of Delta Force, the brotherhood forged in the crucible of impossible missions. And then, almost reluctantly, he mentioned the cost of that bond. There were nights when we didn't think we'd make it out alive, he said, his voice low and distant, and days when we didn't. The kid listened, his chest tightening with every word. He thought about the names etched on memorials, the faces of soldiers frozen in photographs, the families left behind. These weren't just statistics or headlines. They were real people with dreams and fears and lives cut short. The older man had walked among them, fought alongside them, and ultimately survived them. The weight of that reality must have been crushing. I carry them with me, the older man said suddenly, snapping the kid out of his thoughts. Every single one of them. Not because I want to, but because I have to. They deserve to be remembered. He reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a small wooden box. It was worn and scratched, its surface polished smooth from years of handling. Opening it carefully, he revealed a single dog tag inside, engraved with several names. The kid leaned in to read them, his breath catching in his throat. "These are my brothers," the older man explained, closing the box gently. "They gave everything. I owe it to them to live well, to honor their memory." The kid swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. He realized then that the older man wasn't just haunted by his past, he was driven by it. Those names, those faces, those stories, they weren't ghosts dragging him down. They were anchors keeping him grounded, reminding him of why he had fought and what he had lost. As the weeks went by, the kid began to see the older man in a new light. He wasn't just a mentor or a teacher. He was a living testament to resilience. Every scar, every memory, every lesson he shared was part of a larger tapestry, a legacy woven from sacrifice and purpose. The kid started applying these lessons not just at the range but in his everyday life. Whether it was staying patient during tough workouts or maintaining focus during high-pressure situations, he drew strength from the older man's example. 1. Afternoon, as they cleaned up after another session, the kid decided to ask the question that had been lingering in his mind for weeks. "Sir?" he began hesitantly. "Why do you come here? To the range, I mean. You don't strike me as someone who needs practice." The older man chuckled softly, leaning against the tailgate of his truck. "It's peaceful here," he replied after a moment. "Just me, my gun, and the sound of bullets hitting steel. No distractions, no noise. It's grounding in a way." The kid nodded, understanding more than the older man probably realized. For someone carrying so much history, the simplicity of the shooting range must have been a refuge. A place where he could breathe without the weight of expectations or memories pressing down on him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot, the kid felt a deep sense of gratitude. He knew he was lucky to have crossed paths with this extraordinary man, even if their time together was fleeting. Whatever lay ahead for him, he vowed to carry the older man's lessons forward, not just in his actions, but in his heart. Because sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the ones shouting from rooftops. Sometimes they're quiet old men at the shooting range, teaching the next generation how to aim true, not just with a gun, but with their lives. The weeks turned into months. and the bond between the young recruit and the older man grew stronger with each passing Saturday. What had started as casual curiosity on the kid's part had blossomed into something deeper, a mentorship that went beyond marksmanship or military tactics. It was as if the older man had taken the kid under his wing without ever explicitly saying so. Their conversations became less about questions and answers and more like shared moments of understanding, where words weren't always necessary. One crisp autumn morning, the kid arrived at the range earlier than usual. The air carried a chill, and the golden leaves crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward their usual spot. To his surprise, the older man was already there, sitting quietly on the bench with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. His rifle lay across his lap, untouched for now, as he stared out at the empty targets ahead. "Morning," the kid said, breaking the silence. The older man glanced up and gave a small nod, motioning for him to sit down. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, watching the sun rise over the horizon, its light painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. There was an unspoken comfort in the quiet, a sense that both of them were exactly where they needed to be. Finally, the older man broke the silence. "You've come far," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Further than you realize." The kid looked at him, surprised by the comment. He'd been working hard, sure, but he hadn't thought much about how far he'd come since those first awkward attempts at conversation. Back then, he'd been full of questions, eager to prove himself but unsure of how to bridge the gap between admiration and respect. Now, sitting here beside this man who had taught him so much, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," the kid replied honestly. "Everything you've taught me, it's changed the way I think, not just about shooting, but about life." The older man smiled faintly, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I didn't teach you anything you didn't already have inside you," he said. "All I did was help you see it." It was true in a way. The older man hadn't handed the kid any shortcuts or easy answers. Instead, he'd shown him how to dig deep, how to trust himself even when things got tough. He'd emphasized patience, discipline, and the importance of staying grounded, qualities the kid had begun to embody without fully realizing it. As the day wore on, they practiced together, firing round after round until the targets were riddled with holes. But it wasn't just about hitting the bullseye anymore. Each shot felt deliberate, purposeful, as if the act of pulling the trigger carried meaning beyond the range. The kid noticed how the older man seemed slower that day, his movements more deliberate, almost ceremonial. It was as though he knew something the kid didn't yet. When they finally packed up their gear, the older man hesitated before closing the tailgate of his truck. Reaching into the wooden box he always carried, he pulled out the dog tag engraved with the names of his fallen comrades. Holding it carefully in his palm, he turned to the kid. "This is for you," he said, pressing the dog tag into the kid's hand. The metal was cool against his skin, heavier than he expected. "For me?" the kid asked, stunned. "But why?" The older man's expression softened. "Not because you owe them anything," he explained, "but because someday you'll understand. These men, they gave everything. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered. And now it's your turn to carry that weight." Tears welled in the kid's eyes as he held the dog tag tightly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. He wanted to say something, to thank the older man, to promise he wouldn't let him down, but the words caught in his throat. All he could manage was a nod, his gaze locked with the older man's. For the first time, the older man smiled, not the polite, reserved smile he usually gave strangers, but a genuine expression of pride and hope. It was fleeting, gone almost, as quickly as it appeared, but it left an indelible mark on the kid. In that moment, he understood that this wasn't just about passing on knowledge or skills. It was about legacy, about ensuring that the sacrifices of those who came before weren't forgotten. A few weeks later, the kid returned to the range, expecting to find the older man waiting for him as usual. But when he arrived, the parking lot was empty save for his own vehicle. He scanned the area, hoping to catch sight of the familiar pickup truck, but it was nowhere to be seen. A sinking feeling settled in his chest as he realized the older man wasn't coming today. At first, he tried to convince himself it was nothing. Maybe the older man was busy, or perhaps the weather had kept him away. But deep down, he knew better. Something had shifted, and he couldn't shake the feeling that their time together might be coming to an end. Over the next few Saturdays, the older man didn't show up. The kid waited each week, practicing alone and replaying their conversations in his mind. He missed the steady rhythm of their sessions, the crack of gunfire punctuated by moments of quiet wisdom. More than anything, he missed the presence of the man who had become so much more than a mentor to him. Eventually, the kid decided to visit the older man's house. He didn't know the address, but he remembered seeing the old pickup truck parked near a modest home on the outskirts of town during one of their earlier chats. Driving there felt surreal, as if he were stepping into uncharted territory. When he knocked on the door, no one answered. Peering through the window, he saw the interior was sparsely furnished, with signs that someone had recently moved out. Confused and disheartened, the kid drove back home, clutching the dog tag in his pocket. He spent hours staring at it, running his fingers over the engraved names, wondering what had happened to the man who had given it to him. Had he left town? Was he okay? Or was there something else? Something the kid wasn't ready to face. Months passed, and the older man remained absent from the range. Life moved forward as it always does, but the lessons he had imparted stayed with the kid. Every time he faced a challenge or doubted himself, he thought back to the older man's words. Fire burns brightest when it's controlled. He remembered the importance of patience, the value of humility, and the weight of responsibility. Those teachings became his compass, guiding him through difficult decisions and uncertain times. Then, one evening, while attending a veterans' memorial ceremony in town, the kid stumbled upon a plaque dedicated to Delta Force operatives killed in action. As he read the names listed, his breath caught in his throat. Among them was the name of the older man who had changed his life forever. Beneath it read a simple inscription: "A hero remembered never truly dies." Standing there, surrounded by fellow servicemen and women, the kid felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Grief, gratitude, pride, all mingled together as he processed the realization that the older man was gone. Yet even in his absence, his legacy endured. Through the dog tag in the kid's pocket, through the lessons etched into his memory, through the values he carried forward, the older man lived on. As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, the kid lingered by the plaque, tracing the letters of the inscription with his fingertips. He made a silent vow to honor the older man's memory, not just by excelling in his training or fulfilling his duties, but by living with purpose and integrity. He would pass on the lessons he had learned, ensuring that the sacrifices of those who came before were never forgotten, because sometimes heroes don't wear capes or medals. Sometimes they're quiet old men at the shooting range, teaching the next generation how to aim true, with their hearts as well as their guns. And, though they may leave this world, their impact remains, shaping lives in ways they'll never fully know. Years passed, and the young recruit who once stood wide-eyed at the shooting range grew into a seasoned leader. His journey wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, failures that tested his resolve, and sacrifices that weighed heavily on his shoulders. But through it all, he carried with him the lessons of the quiet old man who had once taught him how to truly see the world. The dog tag, now worn smooth from years of handling, hung around his neck like an anchor, a reminder not just of those who had fallen, but also of the values they represented. By the time he rose through the ranks to become a decorated commander, he had earned respect not only for his skill, but for his character. He led by example, always prioritizing the well-being of his team over personal glory. A true warrior doesn't seek recognition, he often told his subordinates, echoing the words he'd heard so many years ago. He seeks purpose. Those under his command admired him not because he was fearless, they knew he felt fear as deeply as anyone, but because he faced it head-on, using it as fuel rather than letting it paralyze him. Despite his success, he never forgot where he came from or the man who had shaped him. Whenever he found himself at a crossroads, unsure of what decision to make, he would close his eyes and imagine the older man sitting beside him, calm and steady, offering guidance without ever needing to say a word. It was almost as if the older man's presence lingered in the background of every choice he made, reminding him to stay grounded, to think beyond himself, and to honor the legacy of those who had paved the way. One evening, after returning from a particularly grueling deployment, he attended a veterans reunion organized by his unit. The event was held in a modest hall filled with men and women from different generations, each carrying their own stories of service and sacrifice. As he moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging greetings, he noticed an elderly couple standing near the back of the room. Something about them caught his attention. The way the woman clutched a framed photograph close to her chest, her eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of hope and sorrow. Curious, he approached them cautiously. "Can I help you?" he asked, gently, sensing there was more to their story. The woman looked up, startled, then glanced at the photo she held. "We're looking for someone," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "My husband, he served with Delta Force during Vietnam. We lost touch years ago, but we recently learned he might have been living nearby before he passed." Her words sent a chill down his spine. Without thinking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the dog tag. Holding it up, he showed it to her. "Is this him?" he asked, his heart pounding. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, reaching out to touch the metal. "Yes," she whispered. "That's him. He used to talk about passing this on to someone worthy, someone who would carry the torch." For a moment, no one spoke. The room seemed to fade away, leaving only the three of them standing there, connected by threads of memory and gratitude. The woman introduced herself, explaining that her husband had rarely spoken about his time in Delta Force, preferring instead to focus on helping others quietly, without fanfare. She described how he had spent his later years mentoring young recruits at the shooting range, sharing pieces of wisdom while keeping much of his past hidden. "He always said he didn't want people to remember him for what he did," she continued, smiling through her tears. "He wanted them to remember him for who he was, a man who believed in doing the right thing even when no one was watching." Hearing these words, the commander felt a lump rise in his throat. He realized that in many ways the older man had succeeded. Though he had lived a life of humility, his impact rippled outward, touching lives long after he was gone. The commander shared his own story with the woman, recounting how her husband had changed the course of his life. By the time they finished talking, both were overcome with emotion, united by the bond of shared memories and mutual respect. In the months that followed, the commander began visiting the woman regularly, learning more about the man who had mentored him. She showed him photographs, letters, and mementos that painted a fuller picture of the husband and father she had loved. Through her stories, he discovered new facets of the older man's personality, the playful side that loved telling jokes, the tender side that doted on his grandchildren, the resilient side that refused to let bitterness take root, despite the hardships he endured. But perhaps the most poignant revelation came when she handed him a journal. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and reflections, fragments of thoughts the older man had jotted down over the years. Some entries detailed tactical strategies, while others explored deeper themes of leadership, morality, and the human condition. Reading through them felt like having one last conversation with the man who had meant so much to him. One passage stood out in particular. "To lead is not to command, but to inspire. To teach is not to lecture, but to listen. And to live is not to exist, but to leave something behind worth remembering." Those words resonated deeply with the commander, reinforcing everything he had come to believe about leadership and legacy. From that day forward, he vowed to embody those principles, not just in his professional life but in every interaction he had. Whether it was mentoring younger recruits, supporting fellow veterans, or simply being present for his family, he strived to live with intention and purpose. Decades later, when the commander finally retired, he dedicated his time to preserving the stories of those who had served, He traveled across the country speaking at schools, community centers, and memorials, ensuring that the sacrifices of soldiers like the older man were never forgotten. Each speech began with the same opening line. Heroes aren't defined by their titles or achievements, they're defined by the lives they touch and the values they uphold. And though he never mentioned names or specific missions, his audiences could feel the authenticity in his words. They saw in him the embodiment of the lessons he preached: patience, humility, resilience, and left inspired to carry those values forward in their own lives. On his final visit to the shooting range where it all began, he stood alone, gazing at the empty target swaying gently in the breeze. In his hand he held the dog tag, its surface worn smooth from years of use. For a moment he closed his eyes, imagining the older man standing beside him, watching silently as he took aim. "Why, did good, sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "Your legacy lives on." As he turned to leave, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the range. The quiet old man may have been gone, but his presence remained, in the hearts of those he touched, in the lessons he passed down, and in the countless lives shaped by his unwavering belief in doing the right thing. Even in death he continued to inspire, proving that true heroes are remembered not for what they accomplished, but for the light they leave behind.